In today's video, we'll be using drawing as a tool to improve information recall. We'll be exploring the 4 abdominal muscles that help keep our internal organs in place, support our trunk, and allow for better, more optimal movement. I recently created a summary sheet on the abdominal muscles, and now I'm focusing on the visuals. When studying, I've always loved making visually organized summaries, almost like storyboards. Diagrams and images that condense long paragraphs have always taken priority in my notes. Why? Because it's so much quicker to absorb information from an image than to sift through pages of text saying the same thing. I'll link the books I've used so far in the description box below. The anatomy book I'm using is called Trail Guide to the Body, and as you can probably tell, it's been well used. Let's get to it. The abdominal muscles are made up of 4 muscles. From the most superficial to the deepest layer, you have the rectus abdominis, the external oblique, the internal oblique, and the transverse abdominis. The last 3 expand to the sides of the thorax, making a strong girdle that stabilizes the entire abdominal region thanks to the specific layering and varying fiber direction. If you want to create a very simple visual of the fiber direction of each muscle, here's an example reproduced from the Trail Guide. You have the deepest muscle of the group, the transverse abdominis, with its fibers running parallel to the pelvic bone, reinforcing the area below the belly button, if trained properly, and especially strong around the waist. Then you have the internal oblique with its fibers running down like an upside-down V. The fibers of the external oblique, on the other hand, run in the opposite direction in the shape of a V. Finally, the rectus abdominis is the least wide of the bunch and runs straight down from the ribcage to the pelvis. So this is if you wanted to keep it really simple. If you want it to be an opportunity to practice insertion and origin points, then you can draw them individually and use a picture that is a realistic representation of the human skeleton. I just grabbed one at random on Google. I'm using Procreate to create each muscle on an individual layer as I want to use these images in the future. Now, I didn't have a tablet during school, so what I would have done instead is print out the human skeleton in varying viewpoints and insert the pages in sheet protectors. That way, I can use a draw erase marker and test myself continuously for any muscle group I'm learning about. Trust me, things do not need to be complicated. The rectus abdominis originates at the pelvis and inserts at the cartilage of the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs and xiphoid process. Based on that, we can see that the rectus abdominis can tilt the pelvis backward and pull the ribcage down, indirectly flexing the vertebral column forward. The external oblique extends from the external surfaces of the 5th to 12th rib, inserts down at the pelvis and anteriorly onto the linea alba, located along the midline of the abdomen. By using a picture like this, it's easier to visualize how, unilaterally and indirectly, the external oblique will allow for lateral flexion of the spine on the same side and trunk rotation on the opposite side. I say indirectly because there are no insertions onto the spine itself, so movement will happen through its action on the ribcage. Bilaterally, it will flex the spine forward by pulling down on the ribcage and therefore making the ribcage slightly more narrow as well. Finally, in terms of the pelvis, it will rotate the pelvis backwards. The internal oblique originates, contrary to the external oblique, at the pelvis and inserts at the internal surface of the lower 3 ribs and onto the linea alba at the front. Unilaterally and indirectly, the internal oblique will allow for lateral flexion of the spine on the same side as well as trunk rotation on the same side. It will also flatten the ribcage by pulling it down and to the side of the pelvis, and when contracted bilaterally, will indirectly flex the spine forward. In terms of the pelvic bone, it will rotate the pelvis forward. So, to summarize, here is another way to visualize the information about both obliques. When it comes to the spine, they both allow for forward flexion of the spine when contracted bilaterally. Unilaterally, they both allow for lateral flexion on the same side of the muscle contraction. They differ in trunk rotation, where the external oblique rotates to the opposite side of the muscle contracted, whereas the internal oblique would rotate the trunk to the same side. Finally, when it comes to their action on the pelvis, the V-shaped fibers of the external oblique would pull the pelvis backwards, whereas the internal oblique pulls it forward. Finally, the transverse abdominis originates at the pelvis, thoracolumbar fascia, and internal surface of the lower 6 ribs. It inserts anteriorly onto the linea alba. Out of all the abdominal muscles, this one has the least action on the skeleton. If anything, it might pull each side of the rib cage slightly closer. Then again, the fibers are very short and the movement would be minimal. The transverse abdominis has more of a visceral role in that at the waist, where its fibers are the longest and strongest, would tighten this area quite significantly, pushing part of our organs upwards toward the thorax and the rest downwards towards the pelvic floor. It's actually an incredibly powerful contraction that happens involuntarily, just like when you sneeze, cough, vomit, or give birth. Towards the lower part of the stomach, the transverse abdominis, if trained properly, reinforces the border and allows for the abdominal contents to be tucked in. This can be trained by contracting the pelvic floor muscle in combination with pulling the lower stomach towards the spine. Think the part below the belly button. This way, we create a type of zipper effect with our core engagement, where we are pushing the abdominal contents back and up instead of down and forward, which is especially crucial for people who have pelvic floor issues, incontinence, and prolapse. I would like to say at this point in the video that this is not an anatomy course. I'm keeping things very, very simple here. It was really just to showcase different study tools that you can use that might be just a little bit more fun than reading pages of information. So this is, again, not an anatomy course. So just to wrap this up, here is a look at each muscle individually, and then from deepest to most superficial all together. I hope this video helped you get inspired, be creative, and have fun learning. See you next time.